good evening, and welcome to Bible study for today, Wednesday, the 17th of August of 2022. I am the Reverend James Merriam. I'm the pastor at the Wells River Congregational Church here in Wells River, Vermont, and it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to this time of Bible study, this time of devotion, this time of reflection, and to assure each and every one of you that whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey and wherever you are in the world and whenever you join us in this time of devotion and reflection, or just take this as a quiet time, or have this on in the background while you're doing something else. Thoughts and hopes and prayers and learning and just the opportunity to be together by whatever means and in whatever way we can bring gladness to the Lord and are a blessing whenever we can make them happen. So welcome to Bible study. Welcome to this chance to consider and reflect a little bit on different pieces of scripture and passages, times that we would perhaps not get to otherwise. Now this week I'm going to be reading from the lectionary, from the cycle of scripture that are suggested for each week. Though what I'm reading is from the prophets, and I don't have a preview of what's going to be happening on Sunday because I actually haven't decided quite what we're going to do on Sunday. We've had a number of Sundays in a row where I had sort of a pre-prescribed plan, and there was sort of something that fit to every particular Sunday. But this Sunday is completely unencumbered, completely undirected, and so I'm still sort of waiting for the inspiration to strike. But that means we can dive wholeheartedly and completely into what is maybe the juiciest and most interesting of the lectionary texts for this week. It's pretty clear why this lectionary text was chosen. The gospel text, reading through Luke currently, is about Jesus curing on the Sabbath day, curing someone of a really severe affliction while they're actually in their sort of weekly worship service in the synagogue on a Sabbath day. And that the local leaders, and that he's in some sort of just a small town synagogue, not in the big temple or anything like that. The local leaders admonish him, and that he admonishes them even more severely, and everyone is really surprised and really impressed. What is paired with that here is Isaiah talking about the Sabbath right near the end of the book of the writings of Isaiah 58. And perhaps kind of amazingly, and I think by accident, because I think this understanding had not really been developed when these two passages were put together. I think it's by accident we have Isaiah and Jesus saying very similar things about the Sabbath, even though at first blush, and if you take just the particular verses that are immediately around the descriptions of the Sabbath, then you might get the impression that these are point and counterpoint to the same idea, or that Jesus is revising or revoking the instructions given, or especially the guidance given by Isaiah, but just generally the sort of more ancient instructions on how to treat the Sabbath. And still, and to this very day, we are certainly challenged by the Sabbath. There will be people among you, there are people in every congregation who remember times when it was either by convention or by very, very firm and often very aggressively enforced laws that the Sabbath was kept in very prescribed ways. What we might once have called, what were for a long time called blue laws. Now, of course, this is a greater challenge when you have a multi-faith community and different days are considered the Sabbath. But if you have all one consensus on what day the Sabbath is, there's at least a more universality to that kind of a thing. However, of course, this coincided with debate that continues really to this day about what day of the week the Sabbath rightly should be considered, because, of course, what's described in the Old Testament is the Jewish tradition of taking Saturday as a day of rest and a day of the focal point of faith. Actually, so much so that there was confusion for centuries in ancient Rome as to why the Jews were so focused on Saturn, on the god Saturn, who was venerated on Saturday. That's why we still call it Saturday. And why they were just fanatically devoted to Saturn. Of course, we get the word Saturnalia, and so it's a very deep confusion and a huge cultural gulf, apparently, to end up with that particular confusion. But that's just a fun side thing. It does also say in the New Testament that when Christians got together for their worship, they got together on the first day of the week, the day after the Sabbath, the same day that Jesus rose, on Easter, on a Sunday, on the first day of the week, on the day after the Sabbath. And really, that it's been argued, though it's been ignored in many circles for a long time, that rightly Sunday is the Lord's Day, while Saturday is the Sabbath, and that the focal point of Sunday, of the Lord's Day, is not to do no work, to rest. The focal point is to do the Lord's work. So to have 1 out of every 7 days be fully devoted to active work on behalf of God, and 1 day out of every 7 to be dedicated to rest. That's a more contemporary, and especially in Reformed Protestant churches, came along in that direction. In some other circumstances, in some other cultures, the decision was just to shift the calendar and claim that Sunday was just the 7th day of the week, was the last day of the week, and that anything about the first day of the week was referring to Monday. So these are all potential arguments, all that have some basis in Scripture. But the concept of a Sabbath, the concept of what it means to rest, is really at the heart of what's going on in both of our scriptures, both of the scriptures that are being that are relevant this week, but especially in the Luke, and now we're going to be reading the Isaiah. I'm going to start a little bit earlier in the chapter than the lectionary suggests, because the lectionary kind of hones in on the Sabbath portion. But I think it's important to get a little bit more before. And unfortunately, Isaiah really is in full flow. Like, even the chapter breaks are sort of artificial. So you kind of have to just drop in somewhere and go from there. So I'm going to start a couple of verses earlier with verse 7, and then I'm going to read to the end of the chapter, which is verse 14. The lectionary has us dropping in the middle of verse 9, but I think I'm going to start earlier. So this is Isaiah 58, beginning with verse 7, reading from Robert Alter's translation. This is the middle volume, the Prophets, and I'm right in the middle of it, right at the end of Isaiah. Yes, to offer your bread to the hungry, and bring the wretched poor into your house. When you see someone naked, you should clothe him, and your own flesh do not ignore. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing quickly spring up. And your vindication shall march before you. The Lord's glory shall be your rear guard. Then shall you call, and the Lord shall answer. Cry out, and he shall say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the mocking finger and vicious speech, and you proffer your bread to the hungry, and sate the appetite of the afflicted, then your light shall dawn in the dark, and your gloom shall be like noon. And the Lord shall guide you always, and sate your appetite in arid land, and your bones he shall strengthen. And you shall be like a well-moistened garden, like a water source whose waters do not fail. And from among you they shall rebuild the ancient ruins, foundations laid in times past you shall raise. And you shall be called repairers of the breach, restorers of paths for dwellers. If you refrain from journey on the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the Lord's holy day respected, and honor it by not following your ways, not pursuing your affairs and speaking in vain. Then shall you delight in the Lord, and I will mount you on the heights of the earth, and make you thrive with the estate of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So first off, of course, we have a repetition of the call to give bread to the hungry and care for the afflicted. Specifically, we also have the call to clothe the naked. Of course, clothing was very expensive in the ancient world. It was also usually very high quality and very versatile. We hear this a little bit in Jesus talking about giving both cloak and coat to someone who robs you. There's a lot of versatility in sort of, you can make like a bed, and you can set yourself up for rain, and you can set yourself up for hot weather and for cool weather. So this is as much giving someone means for doing all things, for traveling all places and doing whatever, facing and being able to handle whatever comes along in life. It's more like giving someone a home. We also have, and this is some topic for debate, Alter in his translation and in a note at the bottom makes it pretty clear that what we're talking about is sort of, that this passage perhaps is a throwback to the story in Noah, talking about the seeing of flesh back in Genesis. And that makes this a reference specifically to all your fellow human beings. This is less a divine commandment than it is just like a humanistic one. That this is so basic and so essential of out of common humanity, take care of one another, give one another what they need to make their way in the world, either to stay in the place where they are or be able to travel home or to somewhere where they can make their way. So then it is to understand this. What is promised is the light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing quickly spring up, and your vindication will march before you. Again, we have that repetition, and then it says that you will be like a well-moistened garden, like a water source. You will have strong bones, and yes, the Lord shall guide you always. Your light shall dawn in the dark, and your gloom shall be like the noon. That in this time, even the worst day in the community, and there will be bad days, but will be better than the best day now, better than the best you can imagine now. There's also the interesting and unusual thing that's used as the first line of the lectionary text is, if you remove the yoke from your midst, the mocking finger and vicious speech. That's certainly very poetic and certainly very memorable. It's also very difficult to understand because this particular, not necessarily this word, but this particular usage, according to Alter, is completely unique in all of Scripture. And the pointing finger, we have to sort of infer by the circumstance, because it does specifically say pointing. It doesn't, he puts the word mocking in, inferring that out of context. But from the context, but that it is pointing finger. So that could be the finger of accusation, the finger of direction, but in context and of vicious or just ill-meaning verbal accusations. Of course, the finger of mockery, not the finger that necessarily directs any actual or active harm, but what is through speech and accusation, just the degrading and just the knocking down of people around us. So if you remove the yoke and the mocking finger and the vicious speech, so it's not just the actual physical or legal or emotional burdens that you put on one another, to recognize that also the weight of accusation, the weight of ridicule, the weight of anger on both the target and really truly on the perpetrator of the anger or of the mocking is too heavy a burden for a society to bear. And it is one at the very front of what needs to be improved to improve a society. So sate your appetite in a barren land, strengthen bones, well-moistened garden, and from among you they shall rebuild the ancient ruins. Foundations laid in times past you shall rise, and you shall be called repairers of the breach, restorers of paths for dwellers. This is certainly is going to be a familiar little passage. Restorers of the breach has become a very prominent rallying cry among those who really hold up this whole section of the passage, especially in the campaign for support of the poor in very real ways from all levels of society, from government, from church, and from other civic institutions and civic life. You shall be called repairers of the breach. That is, a breach specifically refers to a hole in a defensive wall. So it's those who would fill the breach are defending everyone through their particular actions. And especially if the wall is fallen, it is the weak, the poor, and the most vulnerable who are most likely to fall victim to attack in one way or another. So, and you should be called restorers of the breach, restorers of paths for dwellers. This is a confusing phrase, and actually Robert Alto doesn't have any real idea, can't really suss exactly what's meant, though it's strange, and it doesn't specifically, because it's sometimes read as referencing the return from the exile. But we are, and it's pretty well thought through, we're actually way after the exile. This is the very near the end of the book of Isaiah, probably the third person to go by the name Isaiah. And we're well after the exile, more in like the time of Ezekiel, when people have returned from exile, people have returned to the promised land, and things have been rebuilt, but things aren't going as well as anyone. Oh, it's raining. That's what's going on. Things aren't going as well as folks would have hoped and would have expected by this point. You would think coming back to Jerusalem would make everything better all of a sudden. But to this point, they really aren't. So to say it's restoring of paths for dwellers, that paths, you don't necessarily need a journeying path. You don't need a road if you're already home, if you're already in your home dwelling. So perhaps this is an extension of this just safety and security for all, one from one end of society to another. Dwellers perhaps meaning not citizens, not the natives, not the strong people in a community, but the weak who are just sort of around. Because it seems always that the poor and the weak, as Jesus says, will always be with you. There'll just always will be people around. And that making safe places for them to just go about their daily business is a holy action and what's being called for. Then we say, if you refrain from journey on the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the Lord's holy day, respected and honored, and honor it by not following your ways, not pursuing your affairs and speaking in vain, then you shall delight in the Lord. So talking about the Sabbath, but also in context of what we've all been talking about all the way along, is especially to not force your ways of Sabbath onto others, especially those for whom it is especially a burden to take the day off, and not only to take the day off, to not work, but to have a lot of laws and rules and restrictions, often very expensive rules and restrictions, even just from lack of income from not working. Difficult, burdensome, tiresome, really problematic. And that's where this being third Isaiah becomes most significant, because this is pretty clearly Isaiah railing against the way over prescription of the Sabbath in these laws of interpretation and interpretations that were coming up and up and up and up, apparently, in his time. It would seem, as much as anything, of people looking for something to get animated about. Because we're in the Persian period. We're in the period where Judea, Jerusalem, is just this little tiny, tiny place in one corner of a great empire. And Judea would be in that capacity for most of the rest of its history, just this tiny, tiny little corner of a great empire. So there's no longer any thought, and the great empire is mostly seen as being benevolent, as being a good thing. But looking for things to worry about, basically looking for ways to be holier than other people, because there really aren't any wars to fight anymore. You can no longer be a great warrior, but you can be more holy than the person around you, and you can display your wealth by being more holy and more devout and more fastidious and particular about every single element of the Sabbath. Now, of course, just a couple hundred years later, comes along Jesus, comes along those who would cast him down for doing holy healing on a Sabbath day, that this counts as work. And he counters the point of, obviously everyone does something that's considered work on the Sabbath. This is just hypocrisy and vanity, and it's ridiculous, and exactly the contrary of what we're being called to do, specifically, as it says, pursuing your affairs and speaking in vain. Now, speaking in vain is a complicated thing. Of course, now we would think that in reference to the as George Carlin would say, all the words you can't say on television, profanity, swear words, but that's clearly not what's being talked about. Vanity and profanity, in one instance, just refer to non-specifically holy words, everyday words. Now, obviously, this can't possibly be God telling us to not talk to each other on the Sabbath. That would be ridiculous. So instead, we have to take the other definition of this and what is being brought forward, which is taking the Lord's name in vain words of being words that serve only to puff up our own self-importance. 2, as they say about to kindergarteners, the 3-level thing before you tell a grown-up about something. First off, is anyone in danger? Is there actually a big problem going on? If there isn't, then you don't really need to say anything. 2, is it any of my business? Like, am I involved in this, or am I just tattling on somebody else for this? And that's really, and if not, really, you're probably better off keeping your mouth shut. And 3rd, is saying this thing going to be kind and or productive in any way? And again, in any way productive, in any way helpful, in any way useful, in any way contributing to the good of society or the harmony of people living together. And if you can't even fulfill one of those 3 requirements, you're really better off not saying anything. Now, of course, people break this all the time. So here's Isaiah asking, can you please just not be awful to each other for one day of the week? Can you serve God by not being awful to each other one day of the week? And that example and that break for those who are so often set upon, and it is the weak and the poor who bear by far the greatest burden of these kinds of things. If we can at least give people a rest from that, a rest from worry, a rest from social worry and issue, that in and of itself is worth doing and is wonderful. Now, a couple hundred years later, clearly things hadn't improved too much. Listening to Isaiah hadn't gone super well. Though, of course, in some of Jesus' stories that are told a little less often, you have him saying things like, if you don't learn the message of salvation from Moses and all the prophets, I don't have anything new to tell you. So it's a challenge. It was a challenge then. It's a challenge now. It was a challenge in Isaiah's time. It's a challenge in Jesus' time, and it's a challenge in our own time. Really just about how we take care of one another and how we hold one another accountable. In comedy, this has come up a lot recently of you can make a lot of good jokes by picking on people who don't have any real ability to defend themselves. But that's not really the point of comedy and doesn't really do any good. It doesn't really do any good to society. It just sort of divides us more. Well, those who have the power to defend themselves, those who have power and influence to, as they say, that the court jester or the comedian should punch up rather than punching down, is very, very important and very relevant to the present day. Both Isaiah and Jesus have their own way of expressing that, and it comes with touching on the restriction of people's lives and work on holy days. So with a lot to know and a lot to reflect on, not really a lot of answers, but a lot of questions of faith, we're going to leave it there. I'll be here next week. And we'll have a wonderful worship coming up this Sunday at the Wells River Church, 10 o'clock. Not sure what exactly I'm going to talk about, but Scripture will provide, I'm sure, and then the Spirit will enhance and be there. So God bless you all. Take care, and God.